Welcome to another video. Today we are going to learn a template for writing Skyrim style ambient music. In other words, we'll be learning how to write music that sounds like this. Now, to write this kind of music, we'll need to learn a few different things. We'll start by learning how to write cinematic chord progressions. Then we'll study a useful musical structure for writing ambient tracks, before wrapping it all up by taking a look at all the types of instruments you want to use and their most common roles. So, without further ado, let's get started. Part 1. Creating cinematic chord progressions. So, first things first, we need to learn about writing cinematic chord progressions. Ambient tracks like these will rarely feature a prominent melody. Instead, most of the personality will come from the harmony and instrumentation. Now, while there are many different ways to create interesting chord progressions, the strategy we're going to learn today focuses less on traditional functional harmony and more on contemporary cinematic or epic sounds. Stereotypically epic sounding chord progressions will typically share 4 traits in common. Number 1, they're often built around a simple 2-chord idea that gets expanded by either sentence or period structure. Number 2, they usually stick to just simple major or minor chords. The occasional suspended or 6th chord can be thrown in, but you'll rarely see extended harmony like 7th or 9th chords. Number 3, they typically avoid traditional voice leading conventions in favor of a more rule of cool approach to voicing. And number 4, they will often use the top line of the progression to create a sort of pseudo-melody. Now, if you don't understand what any of this means, or if you're starting to feel a little lost, don't worry, it's a lot simpler than it seems. First things first, we're going to start by picking just 2 chords that you think sound cool together. These could be any 2 chords. It doesn't really matter if they belong to the same key or not. The only prerequisite is that you like the way they sound together. For example, I chose A minor moving into C major. Now, as a little tip, if you're struggling to find 2 chords that you like, try looking for chords that share at least 1 note in common. Chords that share at least 1 common tone will almost always sound good together. Once you've picked your 2 chords, you can use musical structures like sentence structure or period structure to create a full progression. In music, the word structure simply means pattern. These particular 2 structures are simply patterns that the vast majority of music tends to follow at various levels, whether the composers are aware of it or not. You can sort of think of them as being like musical grammar. If you're a native English speaker, you don't really need to know that English sentences follow a pattern of subject, then verb, then object. However, even if you're not aware of that pattern, you're still probably going to speak with your words in that order simply because you learned how to speak by mimicking what you heard as a kid. Music is the same. Even if you're not familiar with terms like sentence structure or period structure, chances are that the vast majority of music you're going to write will at least subliminally follow these patterns, because the vast majority of songs you grew up listening to also followed these patterns. In sentence structure, the pattern goes A, A, B, C, where each letter represents a different motif or combination of 2 chords. Period structure follows the same basic idea, but in a different order. A, B, A, C. For example, let's go back to the 2 chords I chose, A minor and C major. If I wanted to use period structure to turn these 2 chords into a full progression, I would start with just my 2 chords. Period structure then states that I need to find 2 different chords to continue the pattern. Again, these can be any 2 chords, just so long as you like how they sound. You could even repeat one of the chords from your previous motif if you'd like. But for this example, I chose F major and G major. Now, next, period structure says to repeat the original 2 chords. Finally, to wrap it all up, you just need to find another 2 chords that you like. Preferably 2 chords that help form some kind of cadence. In this case, I chose D minor and E major, which help end the entire chord progression with something called a half cadence. For our template, you're going to need to create 2 separate chord progressions. If you want to create more of a nighttime vibe, then try using mostly minor chords. If you want to create more of a daytime vibe, you can use mostly major chords. Regardless, as you use this process, remember that you want to stick to just triads. The occasional suspended chord or sixth chord is fine, but try avoiding sevenths, ninths, or any other type of jazzy chords, unless you just really, really like the way they sound. Likewise, don't worry about voice leading your chords. Instead, focus on simply using your ears to voice each progression in whichever way you think sounds cool. This just means that you can use whatever inversions you'd like to create the sound that you want. It can be helpful to remember that the top line of your progression will act as a sort of pseudo-melody for this template, meaning it's most likely the line that your audience will pay the most attention to. If you would like to learn more about music theory and chord progressions, so you don't have to rely entirely on process of elimination, I have a free class on music theory and harmony that you can check out on my website, as well as a textbook on composing that you can purchase on Amazon as a physical copy or as an ebook from my own website. But for now, once you have your 2 chord progressions, the next step in our template is to use them to sketch out the structure of your music. Part 2, turning your chords into a sketch. Now, as we've established, structure is just simply another word for pattern. And in this case, it specifically refers to a pattern for the number and order of different themes that appear in your music. Since we're not working with melodies in this template, our themes are going to be our 2 chord progressions. One will be theme A, and the other will be theme B. It doesn't really matter which is which, that's up to you. What does matter is that ambient music tends to feature a lot of repetition in its structures. This is partially what makes it sound ambient in the first place. The specific structure we will be using in this template goes A, 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 B, A, A. In other words, theme A will be repeated 3 times before theme B makes a single appearance. Afterward, it's going to be followed up by 2 more repetitions of theme A. Like I said, lots of repetition. This does mean that if handled incorrectly, your music can very quickly sound boring or unimaginative, so we'll need to take some precautions. Before we do that though, let's get everything set up. First, we're going to start by creating a new project and setting the tempo to a slower BPM, somewhere around 60 beats per minute. Next, you're going to pick one of your chord progressions to be theme A, and the other one will be theme B. Finally, super simple, just start copying and repeating your themes until theme A gets repeated 3 times, then theme B gets played once, and then finally theme A gets played 2 more times. So now that we have the very basic structure set up, it's time to figure out how we can keep this from sounding too repetitive or boring. And our secret is going to be something called incremental complexity. Incremental complexity is the best friend of any composer who wants to get a lot of mileage out of a very simple idea. The premise is super simple. You start by introducing an idea. Then you just keep repeating it over and over again. And every time it feels like it's about to get boring or old, you just add something new to the mix and keep repeating. It's a super simple idea, but it works wonders. Now, for our template, I am going to give you a very specific strategy to follow. My recommendation is to use it as practice for a couple of pieces, but then try experimenting with your own ideas to see how you can make changes to create something even better. That being said, let's take a closer dive into the structure. Phrase 1 is going to focus on introducing a super simple, non-harmonically rich variation of our first chord progression. To do this, simply copy and paste the top line of your chord progression to act as a sort of pseudo-melody. Next, we're going to write a second line right underneath. And here, you're going to harmonize the top line using only the root or fifth of each chord. For example, in measure 1, the top line uses E natural, which is the fifth of A minor. Since the top line is already using the fifth of the chord, I'm going to go ahead and use the first in my new voice. If you're confused, just know that the root of a chord, which is the note it's named after, can also be referred to as the first scale degree of that chord. When written in root position, the next note of the chord is going to be called the third, and then the top note will be called the fifth. Even if you change the order of the notes to create inversions, or do anything to change the order in which these notes appear, their names won't change. The root will still be called the first, the next note on the piano will be called the third, and then the next one will be called the fifth. To learn why, you can check out the video linked in the corner of your screen, or you can check out my textbook on composing, which is linked below. But for now, let's get back to our sketch. The next note in our top line is another E natural. which is the third of C major, which means that both the first and fifth are available to choose from. In this case, I decided to go with the fifth, which is just G. You can repeat this process until you have 2 full lines harmonizing with each other. In the very last 2 measures, you are free to include the third of a chord in your new voice, if you'd like, for reasons that we're going to explore in just a second. In this example, I used G sharp in the very last measure, which is the third of E major. And I did this just because I liked the way it sounded. Now, the last step for this phrase is to add a third voice, which follows the same exact process as the second, with one big exception. Until you reach the final 2 measures, you must not form a full chord with your voices. This is to help lay the foundation for our incremental complexity, by starting with a super simple idea that can get expanded upon in the next phrase. For example, in measure 1, the top 2 voices are using A and E, the first and the fifth of A minor. And that's awesome, because it means we can choose either of those for our lowest voice, without really needing to overthink it. In this case, I decided to go with another A. However, in measure 2, things get tricky. The top voices are E and G, which are the third and the fifth of C major. Since I do not want to use the full chord just yet, this means I can't use the first in my lowest voice. If I did, then it would spell out a full C major chord. And since I'm only choosing from the first and the fifth, this means my only option is to double the fifth by using another G. Once again, I will repeat this pattern to fill out most of the measures. However, in the very last 2 measures, this is where I want to switch up the pace and actually fill out the full chord. In measure 7, I had already used D and A, which meant my missing note was F, which is why I put it in the bass. In measure 8, I had already used E and G sharp, which means I needed to place B in the bass. Once I'm finished, I am done sketching phrase 2. In phrase 2, we are going to repeat the same voices. You can even just copy and paste if you'd like. Then, starting in the first bar, we'll start adding a 4th voice, which is going to help fill out all the missing notes so that every measure spells a full chord. Once this is done, we're going to add a 5th voice, which will start on bar 11, 2 bars into the phrase. And then 2 bars later, in bar 13, we'll add another voice. Each voice is going to stick to using only notes taken from the chord progression, creating an incrementally complex and rich sound. Now, as you do this, keep in mind a very helpful tip, that at any individual moment, the third of a chord should never appear more times than either the first or the fifth. This is going to help keep your music from sounding too muddy. In phrase 3, we are going to work with a slightly more complicated texture. The term texture just simply refers to the number and types of different layers in your music. Specifically, phrase 3 in our template will have 4 layers: our chord progression, 2 simple ostinati/arpeggios, and a high pedal point. Now, the chords and the pedal point are the simplest. We already have our chord progression, and a pedal point is just simply a single note that gets sustained or played repeatedly throughout a phrase. In this case, since the chord progression could technically be described as being written in the key of A minor, I chose the pitch A natural as my pedal and placed it high above my chord progression. Now, if you don't know which key your progression is written in, you could also take the time to find out which note appears the most times in your chord progression, and then use that note to form your pedal instead. The 2 ostinati, or arpeggios, are going to be a little more challenging. An ostinato is a short, repeating rhythmic element in music. An arpeggio is a form of accompaniment that uses only chordal tones. Now, I already have a video dedicated to teaching how to write ostinati, so we won't worry about going too in-depth here. For now, let's rely on 2 simple steps. Step number 1 is to create a very simple repeating rhythm. It does not need to be complex. It just needs to repeat. Now, you can add a little bit of variation here and there, just so long as the basic idea remains recognizable within the first 4 bars. Then, whatever you do for the first 4 bars, you want to make sure you repeat in the second half. Step number 2 is to add movement to your rhythm by moving through different chordal tones, like an arpeggio. Once again, repetition is your friend, so don't be afraid to repeat a few ideas here and there so long as it works with the underlying chords. Now, using this strategy, I was able to come up with 2 different ostinati in no time at all, which means I'm ready to move on to phrase number 4. Phrase number 4 is where we finally get to use our theme B, and this one is pretty simple and straightforward. First, just start by creating a bass line a couple of octaves below your chord progression. For now, you can stick to using just mostly the roots of each chord to create the bass line. Ambient music really doesn't require very much complexity in the lower voices. Next, you're going to take the middle voice of your chord progression and drop it an octave. So you have got a nice wide and open voicing of your chord progression. Phrase number 5 will be nearly identical to phrase number 2. In fact, you can just copy and paste if you'd like. The one major difference is you're going to go back and fill out some of the voices so that you have 6 lines going through the entire phrase, instead of introducing them one at a time like we originally did. Then finally, phrase 6 is almost identical to phrase number 3. So again, copy and paste if you'd like. This time, however, we are going to use incremental complexity in reverse by removing a voice every 2 measures. In this example, in bar 3 of the phrase, I removed one of the lines from my chords. Then, 2 bars later, I removed one of the ostinati. Before finally, in the final 2 measures, I removed another line from my chords. And with that, we have a full piano sketch to work with. So that means the very last step is to use this sketch to orchestrate everything. In this template, we are going to work with at least 3 different instrumental sections: the strings, choir, and synths/ambient pads. Now, in general, synths are going to be the simplest. You'll want to find a sound that can just play a constant pedal point in the background of your music, as a strategy for creating a nice ambient backdrop for your music. For this example, I decided to work with a patch called Stealth Angels from the Ethnic Winds library by Quetzal Sounds. Now, if you know what key your chord progression is written in, you can use the root and fifth of your key to create the pad. If not, you can just use the same strategy we came up with earlier. Figure out which note appears the most times in each of your chord progressions, and use your pad to play that note across a few different octaves. It doesn't need to be fancy. This is just meant to be a very subtle sound that stays in the background of your music. Now from here, the rest is going to be pretty straightforward. Phrases 1 and 2 are both going to use strings and choir to play each line. Phrase number 3 is going to give the chords and pad to either the strings or the choir. Phrase number 3 is going to give the chords and pedal to either the strings or the choir. Then, the remaining option can be used to play the motifs. Sometimes it can even be fun to give the motifs to solo instrumentalists, if you're interested in experimenting. Phrase number 4 is played by whichever section did not play the motifs in the previous section. So whoever you gave the chords to, they're just going to continue playing, while the section that played the motifs is going to fade out. Phrase number 5, just like phrases 1 and 2, will use both the strings and the choir. Then phrase number 6 will be identical to phrase 3. But as you start to drop voices out of the chords, you can start to replace them with additional atmospheric pads, gradually fading them in as the other voices fade out from your texture. This is going to help create a gradually transforming sound that contributes to the overall ambient qualities of the music. For this example, I used another pad from Ethnic Winds called Moonfall. Throughout the entire arrangement, you're going to want to use plenty of reverb to give that characteristically wet sound that most ambient tracks are known for. Again, I recommend practicing with this template to see what you can learn about atmospheric music. But eventually, you should try coming up with your own ideas to see what original sounds you can create. Maybe you'd like to add more woodwinds or brass to the mix. Maybe you have a pipe organ library that you want to try. And possibly you have some ideas for how percussion could be added. The sky's the limit here. For now, though, let's listen to the full track that I've written. And as we listen, I'll include notes on the screen so we can follow along with the specific decisions I made while creating this track. And with that, we have reached the end of another video. I want to thank each of my patrons and channel members for making videos like this one possible. If you are interested in learning more or supporting the channel, check out my books on composing, sign up for my class on portraying emotions with music, or even fill out an application for private lessons. Links to all of which can be found on my website, tabletopcomposer.com. Until next time, keep studying, keep working hard, and keep writing new music. I'll see you in the next video.